Yeah. Well, it's mine now. So don't worry about it.
Ritchie Valens was only 17 when America finally learned his name. A poor Mexican-American kid from Pacoima had turned a borrowed guitar, a changed last name, and a Spanish folk song into rock and roll history. But behind the smile was a story shaped by pressure, fear, and a music business that wanted his talent while hiding parts of who he was. In just 8 months, he became a star. Then one freezing night in Iowa changed everything. Why did he get on that plane after years of fearing the sky? The answer is more heartbreaking than people remember. Richard Stephen Valenzuela was born on May 13, 1941, in Pacoima, a poor Mexican-American neighborhood in Los Angeles' San Fernando Valley. His start in life was hard. Pacoima was far from the music capitals people usually connect with fame, and his family lived with constant financial pressure. His parents, Joseph Stephen Valenzuela and Concepcion Concha Reyes, worked as migrant laborers and faced the strain of wartime pay and the layoffs that followed after World War II. At home, Spanish shaped family life, while school pushed English. From his earliest years, Ritchie was already learning what it felt like to live between two worlds in a California that often treated Mexican-American children as though they mattered less. That feeling deepened as he grew up. Pacoima in the 1940s and 1950s was known for smog, factories, and farm fields, not for glamour or opportunity. Mexican-American families usually ended up in the hardest jobs for the lowest pay, and children noticed that reality early. Ritchie heard stories about landlords refusing to rent to Mexican families. He saw kids punished for speaking Spanish in school. At Pacoima Junior High, he watched white students and Mexican-American students get pushed toward very different futures. One group was quietly encouraged to aim higher. The other was expected to settle for labor. In that world, music became deeply personal for him. It gave him space, hope, and a way to imagine a life larger than the one people expected him to accept. What made that dream possible was the sound growing inside him from childhood. At family gatherings, he heard mariachi and son jarocho. On Los Angeles radio, he heard rhythm and blues, jump blues, and the energy of early rock and roll. He began trying to copy melodies when he was still very young, listening closely and turning every sound into practice. Mexican wedding songs sat in his memory beside big band horns and rough guitar licks from American records. That mix stayed with him. Long before the music industry had a name for what he was doing, Ritchie was already building a sound that came from both the barrio and the radio dial. His guitar helped shape that sound in an unusual way. Ritchie was naturally left-handed, but the guitar he had access to in Pacoima was a cheap right-handed one. It was already worn down and at one point had only 2 strings. A neighbor helped restring it and showed him a few basic chords, but Ritchie did not reverse the instrument. He adapted himself to it. His left hand worked the fretboard, while his right hand learned to strum. That awkward setup forced him to invent his own feel. The result was a style that sounded slightly different from what people heard on the radio. By junior high, classmates were already noticing that his playing had its own shape and movement. Because of that, almost every gathering turned into a stage. He brought his guitar to school and played on the bleachers during breaks. Family members remembered him performing at weddings, quinceañeras, backyard parties, and Sunday cookouts until his fingers hurt. Those neighborhood crowds taught him more than any formal lesson could have. He learned which rhythms made cousins dance and which lyrics parents would accept. He learned how to hold attention. He learned how to read a room. By the time a record company ever noticed him, Pacoima had already given him an audience and a training ground. During his early teens, he began writing songs that quietly carried this whole world inside them. Years before he recorded La Bamba in 1958, he was already slipping Spanish phrases into American rock structures and building guitar-driven songs around rhythms rooted in Mexican dance music. That mattered because the music industry in the 1950s did not see Latino musicians as likely rock stars. They were more often treated as background players. Ritchie imagined something bigger. In Pacoima, he was already seeing himself at the center of the song, and when he finally walked into a professional studio in 1958, he was only 17. But he had already spent years shaping the instincts that made him stand out. His first real break came on October 19, 1957, when 16-year-old Richard Valenzuela officially joined a Pacoima band called the Silhouettes as guitarist and featured singer. The group, led by Gil Rocha, played local dances and school events around the San Fernando Valley. Once Ritchie became part of it, things started to change. His rhythm guitar hit harder. His voice carried more urgency. He moved quickly from being the new kid in the band to the reason people showed up. Within months, he was fronting performances at school assemblies and weekend dances, and those appearances became the place where his style sharpened in public. At those shows, he developed a reputation fast. He would take familiar rock and roll songs and drive them harder than anyone expected from a shy high school student. Classmates remembered the force in his singing and the way his performances could suddenly shift in feel. One moment, the song would sound like a standard dance number. The next moment, he would push in accents that felt closer to Mexican dance music than to the white pop records most teens knew. That unpredictability gave the band its edge. Crowds packed school functions because they wanted to see what he would do next. As word spread through the valley in 1957 and early 1958, people started talking about this Mexican kid who could really rock. The audiences around the Silhouettes began to change. Latino teenagers from Pacoima were still the heart of the crowd, but white students from nearby districts also started showing up just to see him perform. In a part of Los Angeles still divided sharply by race and class, his shows created rare spaces where mixed crowds stood in the same room, dancing to the same beat. Adults sometimes complained about the noise or the dancing, but the crowds kept growing and bookings kept coming. What made him different was clear even then. He was not simply copying the stars dominating radio. Instead, he folded ranchera phrases and Mexican song feeling into electric guitar-based rock and used the rhythm and blues influence he had absorbed from black musicians and radio stations in Los Angeles. Even before La Bamba, he was already working out ways to let Mexican rhythm patterns live inside American rock songs. Older listeners did not always know what to make of it. Younger listeners felt it instantly. Bilingual kids heard something of themselves in the music, and that gave his performances a kind of electricity that went beyond skill. By early 1958, the buzz had reached beyond Pacoima. Someone connected to Delphi Records told label founder Bob Keane about a teenage performer in the San Fernando Valley who was filling local events. Keane decided to see him for himself. He watched Ritchie play a short set before a Saturday matinee at a local movie theater and saw the audience demand more. That was enough. On May 27, 1958, 17-year-old Richard Valenzuela walked into Bob Keane's home studio in Los Angeles with a borrowed guitar and very little studio experience. Keane had heard only rough reports and a simple demo. Yet once Ritchie began performing his original material, the label owner saw what he needed to see. Keane signed him that same day. In one living room session, a local high school musician became a professional recording artist. The next move showed the limits of the era, just as clearly as the opportunity. Soon after signing him, Keane decided that Richard Stephen Valenzuela needed a new name for the market. He became Ritchie Valens. His surname disappeared because the label believed white top 40 radio would more easily accept him that way. In the late 1950s, that kind of decision was common, and it meant millions of listeners would hear his records without realizing the new rock singer was a Chicano teenager from Pacoima. Even so, the music itself still carried his roots, and that would become one of the most important parts of his legacy. What also set him apart was how much he could do on his own. He was not just a face handed a song. Before turning 17, he was already writing material, arranging guitar parts, and playing lead in the studio. Bob Keane quickly understood that he had signed a complete young artist. Ritchie could move from a traditional Mexican folk-based number like La Bamba to a soft ballad like Donna, and make both feel natural. During a recording career that lasted only about 8 months, he cut more than 30 songs across 3 albums. That amount of work would have been notable for a seasoned adult performer. For a teenager, it was remarkable. His first national breakthrough came quickly. In July 1958, Delphi released Come On, Let's Go, a short, urgent rocker driven by a stop-start riff and Ritchie's forceful vocal. The single first gained traction on the West Coast, then reached the Billboard Hot 100 later that year. For a boy who had joined the Silhouettes only months earlier, the rise was almost dizzying. One year had taken him from local dances to national charts. Once the record began to sell, Delphi realized they were not dealing with a local novelty. They had found a young star with real momentum. That success brought a painful choice. By the fall of 1958, tour offers, radio appearances, and television bookings were coming faster than school could fit around them. At 17, Ritchie left his senior year behind and committed fully to the career now opening in front of him. For a working-class Mexican-American family in Pacoima, that was not a casual decision. A diploma still represented safety and stability. Yet the music had already moved beyond anything the classroom could contain. Within months, he appeared on American Bandstand and joined the Winter Dance Party tour that would soon place him alongside some of the biggest names in rock and roll. Around the same time, another side of him reached the public through Donna. He wrote the song in 1958 for his real high school girlfriend, 16-year-old Donna Ludwig, whom he had begun dating in 1957 after meeting her at a party where he was playing guitar. That detail gave the song an emotional weight many teen records did not have. This was not an invented romance created by a label. The girl was real. She was still in school. She could hear her own name on the radio. Donna later remembered hearing the full song in her car and feeling the shock of that moment as friends reacted around her. The record slowly gained momentum after its release in October 1958. It entered the Billboard Hot 100 on December 15, 1958, and kept climbing. On February 23, 1959, Donna reached number 2, held out of the top spot by Frankie Avalon's Venus. By then, Ritchie was already gone. He had died in the plane crash of February 3, 1959. The tragedy later remembered as the day the music died. He never saw the song become the biggest hit of his career. That fact gives Donna an ache that listeners still feel. A private teenage feeling became a national memory after his death, and the tenderness of the song only grew more powerful because of it. The single carried another surprise on its other side. Donna was the A side, while La Bamba sat on the B side when Delphi released the record in late 1958. At first, Donna looked like the safer commercial choice because it was in English and fit the teen ballad market. La Bamba seemed like the unusual extra, a rocked-up take on a traditional Mexican song that most American radio programmers would probably treat as a curiosity. Instead, DJs began flipping the record and playing that side too. What had been treated as secondary soon became one of the most important recordings in rock history. That made sense once people heard what he had done with it. La Bamba came from a centuries-old son jarocho wedding song from Veracruz. In 1958, Ritchie rebuilt it as a 2-minute rock and roll record with electric guitar, driving drums, and a structure that could sit beside the hits of the day while still keeping its Spanish lyrics. He recorded it at 17 in Los Angeles for Delphi, singing words he had largely learned phonetically because English was more common than Spanish in his home life. Even with that challenge, he kept the song fully in Spanish. That decision mattered. American rock radio in the late 1950s was overwhelmingly English-speaking, and yet here was a teenager placing Mexican sound and language directly inside mainstream youth culture. When La Bamba entered the Billboard Hot 100 in early January 1959 and climbed to around number 22, it marked one of the first times a fully Spanish-language song had broken into the American Pop Top 40. For Mexican-American listeners, the moment carried deep meaning. The industry may have shortened his name to make him easier for white radio to accept, but the record itself gave no ground. It brought Mexican rhythm, Spanish words, and a huapango feel into a space that had rarely welcomed them before. Over time, people came to see La Bamba as a turning point, the moment Latino identity moved to the front of American rock instead of hiding in the background. That importance only grew in the decades after his death. Critics and musicians looked back and understood how much he had done in such a short time. Artists across later generations, from Carlos Santana to Los Lobos to Selena, would work within paths he helped open. In 2018, the Library of Congress added his 1958 recording of La Bamba to the National Recording Registry, recognizing it as culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant. The song's place in American music no longer needed defending. It had already lasted. On October 6, 1958, 17-year-old Ritchie Valens flew from Los Angeles to Philadelphia to appear on Dick Clark's American Bandstand. For a kid from Pacoima, California, this was a huge moment. On national television, in front of millions of teenagers, he lip-synced "Come On, Let's Go," and suddenly, his name was moving far beyond Southern California. The single had been released in August 1958 as Delphi 4106, and within weeks it pushed into the Billboard Hot 100. What made it even more striking was how fast it all happened. He had signed his Delphi contract on May 27, 1958, so in barely 130 days, he had gone from high school life in the San Fernando Valley to a coast-to-coast TV breakthrough. That first appearance opened the door, and before the year ended, he was back on the same stage. On December 27, 1958, Valens returned to American Bandstand, and this time he performed Donna. The song had come out as Delphi 4110, with La Bamba on the B-side, and together they changed everything. By January 1959, Donna had climbed to number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100, while La Bamba reached number 22. At just 17, he now had 2 national hits at the same time. In the middle of all this, he also filmed a brief part in Alan Freed's rock and roll movie, Go, Johnny Go, performing Ooh, My Head in a diner scene. So his voice was on the radio, his face was on television, and now audiences would also see him in theaters. The speed of his rise becomes even more incredible when you look at how little time he actually had. His entire commercial recording career lasted only about 8 months, from his first Delphi session in mid-1958 to his death on February 3, 1959. In that short stretch, he recorded about 29 tracks. Those sessions gave the world Come On, Let's Go, Donna, and La Bamba, along with songs like Ooh, My Head, Little Girl, and We Belong Together. Many were cut at Gold Star Studios in Los Angeles. He was still balancing school until the autumn of 1958, which means he was building a real recording career while still living part of a teenage life. Even so, he was averaging more than 3 finished studio recordings each month before reaching 18. Success brought pressure almost as quickly as it brought fame. Once Come On, Let's Go started gaining attention. In late 1958, manager Bob Keane pushed Valens into a punishing schedule of package tours and television appearances across the United States. That run included Alan Freed's Christmas Jubilee shows and a November 1958 trip to Hawaii with Buddy Holly and Paul Anka. Home became something he barely saw. The pace got so intense that he left high school in the autumn of 1958 because he was almost never back in Pacoima. By January 1959, he was thrown into the Winter Dance Party, a tour that sent musicians across frozen Midwestern roads by bus night after night. For someone who had been famous less than a year, it was a crushing workload. Behind all of this fame was a deeper part of his story that the music business tried to smooth out. Ritchie Valens had been born Richard Stephen Valenzuela in Pacoima, California, on May 13, 1941. He grew up in a Mexican-American family where Spanish was spoken at home and traditional Mexican music was part of daily life. When Bob Keane signed him in May 1958, he wanted the young singer's name changed to Ritchie Valens because he feared Richard Valenzuela would sound too ethnic to white radio programmers in that era. The change was meant to make him easier to sell, yet the same business soon turned around and pushed La Bamba, his rocked-up version of a Veracruz folk song. Released in 1958, it became one of the first major rock hits in Spanish in the United States. So even while the industry tried to reshape his image, his roots still came through in the music that made him unforgettable. That tension between ambition and identity followed him into the Winter Dance Party, where the excitement of fame gave way to exhaustion. The tour opened in Milwaukee on January 23, 1959, with 13 inches of fresh snow on the ground and temperatures around minus 17 degrees Fahrenheit in the morning. The plan was brutal from the start. There were 24 shows booked in 24 days, with stops across Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, and the Dakotas. Some overnight trips stretched 300 to 400 miles, often without a hotel break in between. By February 2nd, when the tour reached the Surf Ballroom in Clear Lake, Iowa, the musicians had already survived 10 punishing days of winter travel, constant performances, and almost no real rest. The route made the strain even worse because it seemed to ignore all common sense. Instead of moving in a clean line from one city to the next, the tour bounced from Wisconsin to Minnesota, back into Wisconsin, then over to Iowa and the Dakotas. On a map, it looked messy and wasteful, and on the road it felt even worse. One trip from Duluth, Minnesota, to Appleton, Wisconsin, stretched more than 350 miles through deep winter weather. At night, temperatures could fall toward minus 24 degrees Fahrenheit. Each zigzag added extra hours on icy roads, extra exposure to freezing wind, and extra chances for the bus to break down. That bus quickly became one of the worst parts of the tour. It had been hired by General Artists Corporation, and almost at once its heating system failed. On the night of January 31st, 1959, after leaving Duluth for Appleton, the bus broke down in rural Wisconsin more than 2.5 hours into the 350-mile trip. Snow kept building around them, while the temperature dropped toward minus 24 degrees Fahrenheit. There was no proper heat and almost no traffic passing by. Drummer Carl Bunch tried to help everyone stay alive by pouring whiskey and burning newspapers in the aisle. They waited there in the freezing dark until a sheriff finally came to rescue them. After that, the physical toll became impossible to ignore. Because the schedule left so little room to recover, The musicians often finished a show, stepped straight onto the frozen bus, and drove through the night without even checking into a hotel. By late January, several of them were already fighting severe colds and flu-like symptoms. Carl Bunch suffered even more. After one of the freezing breakdowns, his feet were so badly damaged by frostbite that he had to be hospitalized and leave the tour. Replacement players were brought in fast, but the rest of the group kept traveling on the same bus, still dealing with poor heat, weak clothing, and almost no relief. For Ritchie Valens, the danger on that tour hit an old fear that had never really left him. On January 31st, 1957, when he was 15, he had been at Pacoima Junior High School in California during a terrifying disaster. An Air Force fighter jet collided in midair with a civilian plane over the school. Debris fell onto the campus, and 3 students were killed, including one of Valens's close friends. After that day, he developed a strong fear of flying, and only got on planes when he truly had to. 2 years later, he found himself trapped on a winter bus that felt dangerous in a different way. It was always cold, always breaking down, and always carrying the threat of frostbite or serious illness. By the time the tour reached Clear Lake on February 2, 1959, Buddy Holly had reached his limit. He was tired of the freezing rides, the breakdowns, and the way the bus was leaving people sick. After the show at the Surf Ballroom, he decided to arrange a private charter so he could get to the next stop near Moorhead, Minnesota, without another overnight ride in the cold. The plane was a small Beechcraft Bonanza with 6 seats, and it was set to leave after midnight. What seemed like a smart and practical way to escape the bus soon turned into one of the most tragic decisions in music history. The choice of who would fly changed quickly in the final hours. Holly first planned for members of his own group to take the available seats, but fatigue and illness shifted everything backstage. J.P. Richardson, known as the Big Bopper, was 28 and running a high fever. He asked Waylon Jennings, who was only 21, if he could take his place on the plane. Jennings agreed. That one act of kindness changed the rest of his life. Another seat became the subject of a simple coin toss between Tommy Allsup and Ritchie Valens. Valens won. He was only 17, already worn down by the road, and glad to avoid one more freezing ride. He reportedly said, "That's the first time I've ever won anything in my life." Those words would later carry a painful weight. The plane itself offered comfort that the bus had failed to provide. It meant warmth, a short trip, and the chance to get ahead of the schedule. After the show at the Surf Ballroom on February 2nd, Holly paid to charter the Beechcraft Bonanza, tail number N3794N, for the flight toward Fargo, North Dakota, ahead of the next date in Moorhead, Minnesota. It felt like a break in a miserable run. The ballroom could hold around 100 to 800 people, and after another long night of performance, everyone involved was worn out. A quick flight sounded simple. It sounded safe enough. It sounded like a way to get a few hours of sleep and maybe even clean clothes before the next stop. That sense of relief made the seats on the plane incredibly valuable. There was room for the 21-year-old pilot Roger Peterson, and only 3 passengers. Holly's bandmates had wanted those seats because they had already gone through too many freezing nights, too many long road miles, and too many reminders that the bus could fail at any moment. A flight of roughly 300 miles to Fargo felt almost luxurious under those conditions. It promised warmth, quiet, and rest. On a tour shaped by discomfort, those few places on the plane came to feel like the best escape anyone could imagine. Still, comfort could not change the weather or the risks waiting in the dark. Roger Peterson was 21 years old and had about 4 years of flying experience, yet he was not fully qualified for instrument-only flight, which becomes crucial when snow and cloud cover erase the horizon. A weather advisory warning of worsening conditions had been issued that night. Reports later suggested Peterson never properly received or fully understood it before takeoff. Near Mason City Airport, the sky was dark, the snow was blowing, and visibility was poor. The pressure of the schedule remained in the background, and that pressure helped push the flight forward. Sometime between about 12:30 and 12:55 a.m. on February 3, 1959, the Beechcraft Bonanza lifted off from Mason City and headed northwest. It never got far. Within just a few minutes, roughly 5 miles from the runway, something went wrong in the snow-filled darkness. Investigators later concluded that Peterson likely lost control after misreading his instruments. The right wingtip struck the frozen ground first, and the aircraft cartwheeled across an Iowa cornfield before breaking into wreckage. No distress call came from the cockpit. The flight that was meant to save time and spare the musicians another bitter night on the bus ended almost immediately. The wreck was found after dawn, around 9 a.m. The plane had come to rest against a barbed wire fence in the field, crushed so badly that witnesses described it as a tangled mass of metal and ice. The pilot's body remained strapped into the smashed cockpit. The 3 passengers had been thrown from the aircraft by the force of the crash. The cold was so severe that by the time the sheriff and the tour manager reached the site, the bodies had already frozen stiff. The violence of the accident left no room for hope. Everyone had died instantly. For Ritchie Valens, the damage was especially terrible. Officials could not identify him by his face and had to rely on fingerprints and clothing. His report described devastating trauma to the brain, multiple fractures in both legs, and severe damage to his left forearm. He had been famous for only about 8 months. He was still just 17 years old. In that short time, he had gone from local teenager to national star, from school and studio sessions to chart hits and television appearances. Then, in the early hours of February 3rd, it was over. By the end of that same day, news of the crash had spread across America. Radio stations interrupted regular programming to report that Buddy Holly, the Big Bopper, and Ritchie Valens had all died near Clear Lake, Iowa. Teenagers who had only recently bought Donna and La Bamba now heard that the young singer they had just discovered was gone. Evening newspapers carried photos of the wreck, and black-bordered notices that felt more like war news than entertainment headlines. For many young fans, the shock was immediate and deeply personal. The loss hit so hard that years later, Don McLean would turn that date into a lasting symbol in American Pie, calling it the day the music died. Valens's body was flown back to Los Angeles in early February 1959, and he returned under his legal name, Richard Stephen Valenzuela. That detail mattered because it brought him back to the family and community that had known him before fame. He was buried at San Fernando Mission Cemetery in Mission Hills, California, in Section D, among other working-class Latino families from the San Fernando Valley. The grave marker used his full birth name. Over time, later inscriptions also connected him to Donna and La Bamba, the songs that had just climbed to number 2 and number 22 on the Billboard charts. Even today, fans leave behind 45 RPM singles and guitar picks as quiet signs that the connection never really faded. For his family, the loss unfolded under a harsh public spotlight. His mother, Connie Valenzuela, had watched her son rise with astonishing speed from a Pacoima student to a national recording star between May 1958 and February 1959. The success of Donna and La Bamba had started to change the family's life and even helped them move out of their small Pacoima house. Then the crash shattered that future before it could settle into anything real. Reporters began calling for comments while funeral arrangements were still being made. Fan mail kept arriving. Radio tributes played his voice again and again. Grief had barely begun, and yet it was already public. His music career was so brief that much of it remained unfinished. At the time of his death, Valens had released only one studio album and a small number of singles. Delphi Records still had demos, live material, and incomplete studio recordings from sessions done at Gold Star Studios in Los Angeles between July 1958 and January 1959. Just 9 days after the crash, on February 12, 1959, the label released his debut LP, Ritchie Valens, and it reached number 23 on the Billboard album chart. Over the next year, more material was gathered from leftover tapes and live recordings. Decades later, collections like The Lost Tapes tried to reveal the fuller artist he might have become if time had allowed him to grow.